All right, Assalamu alaikum. I pray all of you are well. This is a response reaction video to Pints with Aquinas and their recent video using Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Christian Dominican priest, in his disparaging remarks about Islam, and the way that Pints with Aquinas used Thomas Aquinas in trying to dissuade people from embracing Islam, like Andrew Tate. I'm going to go through some things with you. This is a much shorter presentation based upon a long essay I've written on this topic entitled Polemics as Caricature, the False Portrayal of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by John of Damascus and Thomas Aquinas. I've also written a book, and this is the last chapter, one of the main parts of the last chapter of the book, entitled The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Christian Imagination, looking at historical accounts. And so the first thing for us to look at, based upon what Pints with Aquinas are presenting, is for us to understand that Christians viewed Islam in different ways when it first began. Many Christians, particularly Christian priests, couldn't understand what Islam actually was because it was new, it was novel for them. They couldn't understand what was this new faith. And some thought it was a heresy, Christian heresy. Some thought it was some kind of perhaps Antichrist or something. And it became difficult for them to understand what Islam actually was. So you can see here that Michael Curtis writes that rivalry and often enmity continued between the European Christian world and Islamic world. For Christian theologians, the other was the infidel, the Muslim. Theological disputes in Baghdad and Damascus in the 8th to 10th century and in Andalusia up to the 14th century led Christian Orthodox and Byzantine theologians and rulers to continue seeing Islam as a threat. And so when Islam began to spread, they couldn't understand what this faith was, not only in terms of its theology, but how could it be that Muslims have these principles of justice for people, including themselves, Christians, and most particularly Jews, who had been victims of Christian persecution for a long time, particularly, for example, when Muslims traveled to al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, in 711, and you had before that the Fourth Council of Toledo, and Jews were persecuted and forced into baptism, forced conversions, and expelled from their homes. And when Muslims arrived, they saw the justice of Islam in that. But anyway, let's have a look and see. So John Toland, in his work, he says that the Byzantine monk Theophanes, the confessor, was baffled by Islam's continuing success. They couldn't understand what is this faith bringing and how come they have such amazing success. So, for example, in the case of Islamic Spain, you have a period where Muslims, of course, are expanding now. You have the Visigothic nobility that's traveled to the north, the mountains of Galicia, of Asturias, and many, many Visigoths have embraced Islam by this time. They see something in Islam that's something like what their forefathers who were Aryans used to believe about the oneness of God, and so on and so forth. But also in terms of the justice that Muslims are bringing. You had, of course, the Fourth Council of Toledo, where Jews were persecuted, and now Muslims are bringing a kind of a new, fresh sense of justice for them. In the time of Abdurrahman II, you had a big thing called the Christian Martyr movement, and it was a response, in fact, to the growth of Islam and the fact that many of these Spaniards are embracing Arab culture, Arab literature, Arab literacy, and food customs and dress codes and everything else, and they saw it as kind of perhaps an inroad for them to embrace Islam. These were called the Mozarabs, the Musarabin. And so Christian priests like Alvarez became very concerned about this. And he writes, for example, that the Christians love to read the poems and romances of the Arabs. They study the Arab theologians and philosophers, not to refute them, but to form a correct and elegant Arabic. Where is the layman who now reads the Latin commentaries on the Holy Scriptures? Or who studies the Gospels, prophets, or apostles? Alas, all talented young Christians read and study with enthusiasm the Arab books. They gather immense libraries at great expense. They despise the Christian literature as unworthy of attention. And they have forgotten their language. For every one who can write a letter in Latin to a friend, there are thousands who can express themselves in Arabic with elegance and write a better poem in this language than the Arabs themselves. So, remarkable, the growth of Islam and the way that Christians were perceiving of Islam in its early stages. Now, of course, it's not to say that this is the full picture. There are going to be some small instances of this, discontent for sure. But I mean, in general terms, this is kind of what Christians are expressing. Now, Aquinas is interesting because Thomas Aquinas, order of the preachers, better known as the Dominicans, was founded by Dominic de Guzman in 1216 to counter the heretical Cathars. So you'll hear a lot about heresies in this case. They also sought out and prosecuted heresy beginning after the brutal Albigensian Crusade. That's in Languedoc, 1209-1229. In 1252, the papacy made it legal to use torture while interrogating suspected heretics for the first time. So he's kind of, he's raised in this kind of climate. The goal of the Inquisition was to convert heretics, but those resilient in the heresies were turned over to secular officials for execution. So remember, of course, that this is the content, this is kind of the culture that Thomas Aquinas is living in. To punish heretics. Both Jews and Christians were targeted as well. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 required Muslims and Jews to wear distinguishing clothing. Now, Aquinas characterizes the Prophet, not in everything, but what he does write about Islam does reflect a great sense of ignorance about the faith of Islam, real ignorance about what Islam actually was. And Aquinas was not very familiar with Islam, had not read much about Islamic literature, perhaps hadn't read the Quran, in fact, himself. And so David Kerr, for example, he says that what we find from Aquinas is a fabulous storytelling and slander. And he writes that with deference to Muslim, by the way, this is the late David Kerr, Professor David Kerr, he says that with deference to Muslim sensitivity, I shall draw a veil over the absurdities and crudities of the medieval Christian character assassination of Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the polemical attempts to refute Islam. He writes that Thomas Aquinas, offers a brief tirade against Muhammad in which he claims that Muhammad's teachings are grounded in the promise of carnal pleasure. Pints with Aquinas make a big case about this carnal pleasure thing, and that they are not supported by miracles. Aquinas also says that Muhammad gained support by force and arms, and that his teachings conflict with the Old and New Testaments. This is his main thing. So, for example, number one, that carnal pleasures. Number two, no support of miracles. And number three, support by force of arms. And we'll go through each one of these, inshallah. Now, Davies acknowledges that Aquinas was not very well informed about Islamic thinking. That's what he writes, not very well informed about Islamic thinking, but there is a climate here. And remember, of course, the Crusades before Albigensian Crusade, even before Urban II, you had the genesis of the Crusade, in fact, in Spain itself, Alexander II, Gregory VII, pushing for crusade against Muslims of Islamic Spain. And that same language, the redemption, remission of sins, promise of all these things, was then carried through into the preaching of Urban II. And in fact, it was partly, in fact, I think a big part, against just to show the kind of regnum sacerdotium, the fact that the Pope has this privilege of declaring war himself because he is supreme authority in the world. And it was used against the Byzantines because of the Orthodox schism, just to kind of show that the Pope is able to call for a crusade. But in any case, the language of othering, the misinformation about Islam, Muslims as kind of devil worshippers, and all this kind of nonsense was used. And so therefore Thomas Aquinas was kind of in this environment of crusading language and crusading ideology. And in this case, of course, it was a fight against the heretics, the Cathars, that carries through. So therefore, the initial crusade mission becomes warped into something else by that time. And so he writes that Aquinas offers a brief tirade against Muhammad. Oh, we read that already. Okay, so he says that, secondly, as Michael Frasitio writes in his book, Christians and Muslims in the Middle East, Aquinas was deeply hostile to Islam and provided a deeply offensive and negative caricature of the life and teaching of the Prophet Muhammad. The most repeated point Aquinas touches on in his critique of Islam was the physical pleasure found after the resurrection. All right, he says the Quran's stress on the pleasures of food and sexual relations in paradise proves to Aquinas that Islam is a false religion. Just think about it. So he's saying that because in heaven there is a lot of food and sexual pleasures, this must mean that Islam is therefore false. Because why would it have those things in heaven? And adding to this, Aquinas compares Jesus to Muhammad, peace be upon him, in that Jesus lived in poverty and Muhammad, he says, lived in riches and luxury. So it's really an unfortunate ignorance of what Islam actually is. And it's a shame that in our world today, in 2022, you have people like Pints with Aquinas who are relying on such a person with such ignorance of Islam to try and make a case against Islam. I mean, both Thomas Aquinas and contemporary people today need to be better informed by looking into Islam and reading about Islam themselves, rather than relying on characterizing to try and disprove Islam. Now let's have a look and see. Now, the actual content, of course, is in Aquinas is very negligible, to say the least. Number one, about the Bible, of course, portrays Moses in war, and Christians believe that the God of the Old Testament is Jesus himself. And that's Jesus commissioning Moses for war against people. So what do we say about that? How can Aquinas reject Islam as a religion in which warfare has a place, but not reject Christianity for the same thing, especially since he himself, Aquinas, is an ideological supporter of the crusade? So how does that work then, therefore? Now, secondly, no one who has read even the briefest seerah, like even the briefest life of the Prophet of Islam, would claim that the Prophet lived in luxury and not in poverty. In fact, the Prophet, peace upon him, was against all these things about hoarding of wealth and about being luxurious in wealth, about having too much. In fact, in the Prophet's life himself, he lived and died as a poor person. He was raised as an orphan, and he never acquired money for himself. I mean, for his own sense of gratification. He gave money, in fact, to the poor and to those who are in debt, and to feed the homeless and the needy. That was his life. He didn't live with the splendor of worldly things. He dressed a very simple man. The Prophet never had more than 2 meals in a day in his entire life. The Prophet lived with a few possessions in his home, and that's the end of it. He didn't have that sense of splendor, and nor did he encourage it. He was against it. In fact, once a man came to him in Mecca, and the man was in awe of the Prophet of Islam, and the man began to shake when he saw him, and the Prophet of Islam says to him, "Hawwin alayk fa inni lastu bi malik." He says, "Relax yourself, I'm not a king. I am the son of a woman from Quraysh who used to eat dried salty meat on the floor in the desert." He didn't encourage that. He was against it. In fact, once his companion Umar al-Khattab came to see him, and the Prophet had marks on his back because he would sleep on a mat made of palm fiber and of straw, a straw mat, and he would see the marks on the Prophet's back. And Umar says, "O Prophet of Allah, I've seen how the kings, the Persian kings, the Byzantine kings, I've seen how they live in such opulence, and you are the Prophet of Allah." And the Prophet of Allah says, Prophet Muhammad says, "Are you not pleased, O Umar, that they have this world and we have the next world?" Right? The focus was on the next life as from the bounty of Allah, bounty of God to give his servants such enjoyment. But in this life, there's going to be some pushing back against it, because the Quran is full, I mean absolutely full of warning against the dunya, the world itself, and allowing the dunya to heat people, to take people away from Allah's remembrance, and so on and so forth. And so too, the Prophet's traditions are full of these things about being conscious of Allah, not allowing the world to kind of consume you, being moderate in all things. And so it's a shame that Thomas Aquinas and people even today could get such a basic thing wrong about the Prophet's character, about the Prophet's life, and how he lived. Now, according to William Long, you can see this on the screen, of the above criticisms put forward by Aquinas in a bid to denounce Muhammad can find no support from the objective accounts of Muhammad's work. Can find no support from the objective accounts of Muhammad's work. In the first place, there is no evidence to indicate that Muhammad promoted Islam by tempting prospective Muslims with sexual delights. It was on the contrary. I mean, they suffered in those early years in Mecca. They had nothing. They were boycotted. They would eat like just grass and stuff. They had nothing. His wife Khadija died in that moment, in that time. It's called the Amul Huzn, the year of grief. They suffered. Right? They didn't have those things. They didn't encourage those things. In fact, that was not part of the Islamic call in anything. Not in Mecca, not in Medina, nothing. Right? So, moreover, as stated before, the absence of miracles from Muhammad's ministry does not invalidate his claim to prophethood. And thirdly, remember that when we talk about miracles, the ones that Christians claim that Jesus performed, and we believe in those miracles because the Quran affirms those miracles. Every prophet was sent with miracles for his own people. And the Prophet Muhammad had many miracles in his time. Many things, in fact, would speak to him. Inanimate things would speak. You would have the Prophet feeding people, just like Jesus, for example, small quantities, but feeding hundreds of people. These are recorded in our traditions with authentic chains. So why would it be then you would accept one account, believing he must be a prophet because Jesus, for example, did miraculous things, but not the other one, when you have also the testimony of faith, the testimony of miracles, the historical testimony in this other account also. Now, of course, we do say that the Quran is the most immaculate miracle, meaning it's a lasting miracle. It's a miracle for all people in all times. We say that we believe that Quran is undoubtedly a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in the Prophet's own time, there were miracles that people witnessed him performing, and that would lead many to embrace Islam. And so, also Aquinas' critique of the first Muslims as being brutal and ignorant men is grossly unfair. For instance, many of the first followers of Islam were young men from influential Meccan families. William Long writes, business persons like Muhammad's first wife Khadija and the merchant Abu Bakr and others of similar status were among the first to embrace Islam. Of course, slaves were attracted to Islam, with the most famous one being Bilal, black. Why? Because Islam is calling towards social justice, to believe in the one God, Allah alone, making no partners with him. But then what about the causes? Justice, like for example, the Prophet Muhammad preaching that no, black man is not the same, it's not, there's no virtue of the black man over the white man, or the white man over the black man, or the Arab over the non-Arab, or non-Arab over the Arab, except by the quality of a person's piety, his taqwa, his righteousness, his qualities of fearfulness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning it doesn't mean therefore that your outer form makes you better than anybody else. And therefore Islam did away with that. And people like Bilal were attracted to Islam because of that. What about people like Sumayya, the first woman martyr of Islam? When the verse was revealed in Mecca, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, when the female child buried alive is asked for what crime she was killed, meaning against infanticide, against a killing of children. Islam promoted, preached that, was very strong against that, even though the Arabs before Islam used to bury their own daughters alive. And Sumayya became Muslim as an early convert to Islam because of these teachings of social justice and so on and so forth. And so he writes therefore that the pagans of Mecca opposed Muhammad and the early Muslims. Some of the said Muslims died under torture, and others were sent to Abyssinia to escape persecution. Therefore, the first Muslims were sincere in their response to Islam. Can such sincerity be equated with brutal and ignorant men? Further, it is untrue to assert that Muhammad coerced others by force to accept Islam. After 13 years of patient preaching and bearing with trials of all kinds in Mecca, Muhammad and his followers migrated to Yathrib, later called Medina. These are the words of William Long in his book, and I'll forward the link for you guys to read his text, a much longer piece as well. And so there are many who have borne testimony to the remarkable positive changes introduced by Islam to the lands it was to impact upon. I'd like to end by looking at the words of William Montgomery Watt, who writes, of all the world's greatest men, none has been so much maligned as Muhammad. It is easy to see how this has come about. For centuries, Islam was the greatest enemy of Christianity, of Christendom. For Christendom was in direct contact with no other organized states comparable in power to the Muslims. The Byzantine Empire, after losing its provinces in Syria and Egypt, was being attacked in Asia Minor, while Western Europe was threatened through Spain and Sicily. Even before the Crusades focused attention on the expulsion of the Saracens from the Holy Land, medieval war propaganda, free from the restraints of factuality, was building up a conception of the great enemy, just like in urban speeches of the Crusade. At one point, Muhammad was transformed into Mahound, the Prince of Darkness. By the 11th century, the idea about Islam and Muslims current in the crusading armies was such travesties that they had a bad effect on morale. The Crusades had been led to expect the worst of their enemies, and when they found many chivalrous knights amongst them, they were filled with distrust for the authorities of their own religion. It's only a shame, for Christians to promote and use people like Thomas Aquinas in his ignorance of Islam in their attempt to try and dissuade people from embracing Islam today because of what the Prophet Muhammad spoke about or preached. If people were sincere and looked upon the Prophet's life themselves by reading a simple book of the Seerah or reading the Quran, with an objective, a good mind, away from the fabrications of people or whatever, it would have a much more lasting and positive effect on their hearts and minds and consciousness. May Allah give us and give them guidance as well. Jazakumullah khairan. Now, thanks for watching, and do not forget to click the subscribe button right here.